varieties of neoliberal education, Canada, Turkey, and Brazil compared. We're only going to have 3 papers, not 4 as we have in the program, as Gerald Couture had a family issue to deal with. But we do have Sabrina Fernandes, welcome Sabrina, Dr. Simken Koshar, and Marcelo de Andrade Bastos.
So good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to thank the organizers again for their wonderful job putting this conference together. Like, the day has been very interesting. I'm going to present a paper that's coming out of a larger project that I conducted out of my MA thesis, looking to the state of inequality of access to education in Brazil. And when I was looking at the inequality of access, a lot of things about pedagogical practices and content came out as well. And I wanna focus on that part in relation to the interviews I conducted for that research. So I'm talking about, if you read the title of the paper, there's this thing about this cursinho industry. It's an odd name. You say cursinho, but basically it refers to these industry of preparatory courses in Brazil. Brazil presents a really interesting case in terms of access to education at the post-secondary level, because we have this exam that's called a vestibular, and it's a university entrance exam. However, it's not like the SATs. It's an exam that's prepared by each university. It's very individualized according to university. So if a student, let's say, was applying to 5 different universities, that means that that student is going to write 5 different exams. So that sounds a little bit taxing, but it gets worse, because these exams, usually they would last maybe 5 hours, multiple choice questions on up to 10 different subjects, also an essay question at the end, but that's the basic one. There are exams that last multiple days. There are also exams where we have 2 rounds of evaluation. So you write the exam the first phase, and if you don't get eliminated, you get passed along to the second phase, and then a bunch of short essay questions again. So it's very competitive. And you can imagine that students worry about this exam a lot. And your chances of getting into a program are based on what major you're choosing as well. So I'm going to bring up along some ideas that came out from this research and from the interviews in relation to the majors and the career choices the students are made based on the content and the pedagogy that they're being exposed to in this neoliberalization of access to education. So the neoliberalization of education in Brazil has implications for access to education as well as pedagogy. And this is at all levels of learning. And it's also at the formal and the informal systems of education. By formal, I mean your your primary, secondary schools, and then you go on to university. This informal system of education is what I mean by the support systems that are provided for education. For example, this cursinho industry. It's informal, it's not regulated by the government. There are no directives in relation to what the content is supposed to be, how evaluation is supposed to be promoted. And it's also highly privatized. There are a few like free tuition options for cursinho for students from more like marginalized parts of the city. Those are highly irrelevant. Not a lot of people attend them. It's considered that the content and the instruction that's being given at those is not as relevant for the vestibular exam as the ones offered by the private sector. And I'm focusing on the private sector for this presentation then. So my research was in the city of Goiânia in Brazil. It's okay that you don't know where that is. The city has about 2.5 million people, but what's really interesting about it is that it has the highest Gini coefficient of inequality in Latin America for an urban area. You hear that Brazil is a very unequal country. So in Brazil, our Gini coefficient varies depending on the calculations around like 55, 57. On the higher end when we're talking about urban inequality, because it's higher, Goiânia is at 65. 65 means that it's just right below some cities in South Africa, where you actually had like inequality standardized through racialization. So it's really worrisome, and I was wondering, like, how does education play into this problem of inequality in Goiânia? So I did a lot of interviews with students in their first and second year of university at that state's largest university. It's called the Universidade Federal de Goiás. And I did interviews with students who said they attended these cursinho courses to prepare for this vestibular exam. And like the vestibular exam that they wrote to enter this university, but also all the multiple vestibular exams that they wrote at the same time. So before I continue, I just want to provide a broader definition of what cursinhos are. So Mitroulis and Penning, they argue that cursinhos are profit-oriented courses. They're divided by areas of specialization, and they're designed for the more favored population segments. So in Goiânia, cursinhos refer to an industry that provides support services for the vestibular exam, and the preparatory courses are its main product. It's not the only product. There are cursinhos that offer travel packages for students who want to go write the vestibular exam in other parts of the country, for example, because you do have to write the exam at the city where the university is located. And the lessons are normally offered daily in the mornings, afternoons, or evenings, and they include classes on all subjects that are required for the vestibular. There are also some cursinho classes that are geared specifically to the vestibular exam of one university or another. So for example, São Paulo, you hear that in São Paulo you have very competitive universities, and the vestibular is almost impossible to pass, for example from FUVEST. So there are cursinhos that specialize in teaching you the knowledge and the content necessary for you to pass the FUVEST vestibular exam. And the cursinho tuition in the city of Goiânia varied from a fraction of private high school tuition to as high or more expensive than private university tuition. That means almost double the monthly minimum wage in Brazil. So practically it cannot be afforded by the poorer sections of society. At some point in their interviews, all students refer to either private school background as an advantage or public school background as a disadvantage. Cursinho attendance was often grouped together with private schools as a way to gain an edge against their competitors at the vestibular exam. They never referred to their friends as their peers, unless they were writing the exam for a different major or a different university. And the cursinho had a primary purpose of helping students memorize information that would be specifically useful for the vestibular. What I'm arguing in this paper is that the cursinho has become normalized as a facilitator of access and even as a mediator between high school and the university for those who do not pass the vestibular exam in their first attempt. I interviewed students who had been writing the vestibular exam for 5 years, 6 years, taking cursinho after cursinho because they couldn't pass for the major that they wanted at the university that they wanted. Public school students in particular see the cursinho as a gateway to university because it offers them the chance to learn specific content to which they were not exposed at the public sector. The objective of learning for these students is to absorb material that will help them pass the vestibular, even if it is content they are not interested in, it is not useful for their specific majors, or does not help to develop critical thinking. The consequence is the view by some participants from this research that a plausible way of facilitating their access to university would have been to even take cursinho earlier in their educational path. So there were students actually were taking cursinho at the same time as they were attending high school classes, which means it took their entire day. And there's some research that was done, not a lot. One was this MA thesis by Ricardo Fortes, and he developed this idea of this cursinho effect. Is the materialization of cursinho time and financial investment into vestibular success. This impacts how the educational institutions frame their missions and how teachers and students view their activities and goals. This is all framed within the human capital paradigm, and I'm sure I don't have to go along and explain a lot about this because of all the people in this room. But basically, we know that the human capital perspective entails that education and training are equivalent to a specific type of capital input that can be used to generate wealth. It directly affects the most important commodity in capitalism, labor power. Human capital theory transforms every worker into a capitalist who is individually responsible for managing their own human capital investment to guarantee their employability. So this paradigm also promotes the inequality of education is a result of individual failure due to insufficient effort or investment. In general, this internalization of responsibility ensures that negative outcomes are perceived as personal failures, even when the circumstances of failure are systemic and beyond the individual's control. So since the students heavily associate the vestibular success with preparedness, they deem it irresponsible to neglect the opportunity to prepare offered by the cursinho. So I have some quotes here, like from the interviews that were interesting. So a student said to me, "I thought that the school was enough for learning. I could have sought the cursinho either earlier, like since the first year of high school, or taken a foreign language course. It would have helped." Another student said something to the same effect. "Partly, I would have changed my own effort too. If I had been more engaged, I think that if I had made more of an effort, given the best that I could, I would have passed the exam at the first try too. I think I also failed myself in this aspect." Individual responsibility requires more personal investment. So when I went to do the interviews, I thought students are going to talk about, oh, I need to invest in effort, like the student just said, or I need to invest a lot of money because this is in the private sector. But another interesting thing that came out was investment in time. The time allocated for classes and studying for the vestibular was such an investment to the point where leisure was considered to be a privilege one could not afford. Lesser effort by the student meant putting their educational investment at risk. Some students reported saying things such as, "I began to feel pressure from myself and from my family too, because the cursinho is an investment that the parents make, and since it's an investment, it has to yield a return." Another student said, "Well, the family saw in you an opportunity to improve too. Because if we want to pass, it's an investment. It demands time, it demands money, it demands choosing between staying home, studying, or going out." In a few cases, limited time and finances were associated with health problems as well. One student reported ending up at the hospital because they weren't eating properly. The student was going to high school in the morning and the afternoon, which is very common in the private high schools, that once you reach the senior year, you're preparing for the vestibular, you should have class from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., also Saturdays, and maybe some exams on Sundays. And so the student was doing all of this, and in the evening they were taking the cursinho. Another student said, "Well, a good chunk of my salary was for paying the cursinho. In terms of time, I had to work and study. It was very hard. I didn't have time for practically anything." The student was at the public school. So they reported that their parents were unemployed, so they had to take up a job. So trying to attend public school, having a job, also the cursinho to make up for the lack of vestibular-oriented content at the public school. So I want to speak a little bit about this part of the content and pedagogy in relation to corporate culture and prestige. Henry Giro speaks of the corporate culture in education that leads to a selectivity of what types of knowledge are recognized and rewarded. The focus on individual choice structures society in a way that those with sufficient resources can make a variety of choices, whereas the poor have none to make. This corporate culture has influenced what knowledge students consider to be valuable to them during high school and the cursinho. It also shapes how they make their choices of university majors and also their career choices. I also found that most students describe the cursinho environment as very demanding, thank you, and very vestibular oriented. And they actually praise the cursinho for that. And in the situations where they were coming from public schools, they said, "Well, it's a shame because I am at a disadvantage here because my public school was not as good as the cursinho." So the structure of the university entrance model favors this vestibular content. It prevents students from seeking out other types of knowledge related to critical thinking and analytical skills. At the schools, subjects such as physics and chemistry are taught with more frequency than philosophy or arts because the latter do not carry the same weight and focus at the vestibular as the former do. The selectivity of knowledge ends up translating to a hierarchy of majors, where more instrumental subject areas are assigned higher financial returns, are seen as more prestigious, and are the most competitive majors at the vestibular. The interviews revealed that the demand for a major and competition for the spots available is connected to how prestigious the major is, and even the profession that would spun out of that. And this prestige is how it's considered by students, their families, their teachers, and the society where they live. So many students reported feeling pressure to choose one major over another, even in cases where the student showed no aptitude or interest in that area of study. This pressure can lead to situations where students were writing multiple vestibular exams. They were applying for a different major at each vestibular exam and also at different universities to maximize their chances. A student said, well, in the beginning, it's a little hard with mom and dad when you tell them you want to go to school for visual arts. It's not a very acceptable major. They always want us to do law or medical school or whatever, but it changes with time. Another student reported writing the vestibular exam first for medical school, then law, then environmental engineering. Later, she wrote it for environmental analysis. In the end, while taking the cursinho considering law again, she opted for linguistics because it was less competitive. Her cursinho classes were being paid by a family friend who said she would pay even 5 years of cursinho classes for this student if it meant that this student would go to medical school. So it's a really complicated situation, and in the city of Goiânia specifically, they focus a lot on law, medical school, veterinary school, and also engineering. Also, I just want to clarify this, that in Brazil, you go straight into law and medical school. It's not like in North America where you go and get a BA first and then move on to that. So to kind of wrap this up, I just wanted to emphasize that the vestibular exam itself is creating competitiveness and barriers of access to university. They are structured according to the student's social status. The acceptance by students that this arrangement is beyond their power drives them to the private sector in hopes of improving their level of competitiveness. Here they're trying to maximize their investment and minimize their risk. So if I'm going to invest a lot into these cursinho classes from the private sector, I might as well try harder for a major where I could actually get something back in terms of employability. Because of cursinho, this is transferring even more into how high schools have to structure their content. Private high schools are considered to already do that to a certain extent, although they grade you and they're expected to follow up with these directives that are coming out from the government in relation to what's supposed to be taught at the school. Public schools, not so much. We already have a huge problem with deficit in investment in public schools in Brazil, but it's understood that in public schools, you don't really care that much about the vestibular. A student even mentioned that they didn't really know what the vestibular was until they started talking to friends who were attending private school, because at their public school, that was never mentioned. So the problem with this type of content is that not only are attempts to build critical knowledge curtailed, but the acceptance of this system also makes it stronger and more profitable. So increasing market power and the appeal for new firms to take advantage of this capital opportunity. So this is exactly the case with the cursinho industry. Because it's now a mediator, it's affecting the structure of content and pedagogy before university in general. And I wanted to just emphasize, closing up, that I find that the industry is still very under-researched in Brazil. It's not peculiar to Brazil either. I looked around and there's some similar things going on in Chile and Colombia, although the vestibular exam does make it much more prominent in Brazil. But I believe that it indicates that creativity and the flexibility of the private sector of education in creating new markets and products is turning students and their families away from the state and the state's failed duty to provide accessible and quality public education in Brazil. So it's definitely something that's worthwhile to look more into.